When the nurse offered me some water, my daughter, a doctor, nodded without even turning her head. Ignore her. She doesn't understand anything anyway. I heard it. I didn't mishear. I wasn't deaf. I just stared at the ceiling and counted to 10 so I wouldn't cry. They didn't know I wasn't there as a patient. They didn't know whose signature was on the papers for the building. And while she gives her orders, I'm reading her contract. Carefully. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Martha Blake, and I was 69 years old the day I stepped through the frosted glass doors of Rosebridge Medical Center. I had worked my whole adult life as a city budget auditor in Maine. It wasn't glamorous work, but I knew how to keep track of every cent, every line item, every pattern that didn't belong. Numbers made sense, people less so. I had retired 6 years prior, quietly, without ceremony. I didn't want a sheet cake or a plaque. I just wanted to rest. That morning, I arrived 5 minutes early for my appointment, even though my legs ached and my blood pressure monitor had been flashing red more often than I'd like to admit. I wore a long gray coat that used to belong to my sister and a pale pink scarf she gave me the year before she passed. The scarf still smelled faintly of lavender. I wore it whenever I needed to feel a bit braver. That day, I did. The receptionist didn't look up right away. She tapped on her keyboard, her nails clicking against the plastic like she was in a hurry to finish something more important. Her hair was pulled into a sleek bun, and she had that trained smile, pleasant but impersonal, the kind you give when your patience has been counted in hours and is running out. When she finally acknowledged me, she asked for my name, then gestured toward the clipboard without making eye contact. I took it, filled in the usual forms, and sat in one of the vinyl chairs lining the wall. The waiting room smelled faintly of antiseptic and air freshener, and the television in the corner buzzed with morning news no one was watching. The woman beside me scrolled through her phone, and the man across the room coughed into his sleeve. I looked around and tried to find a piece of art to focus on, but everything on the walls was bland and soothing, deliberately forgettable. I kept my hands folded in my lap. I didn't want to fidget, didn't want to draw attention to myself. I wasn't nervous, not exactly, just cautious. I hadn't been to a clinic in nearly 2 years. My health had always been manageable, nothing glamorous, but nothing urgent either. Still, lately I had felt more tired. Things ached longer. The stairs seemed taller. I decided it was time to check in with someone, just in case. Time passed slowly. My name wasn't called. I looked at the clock above the front desk. 18 minutes late. I didn't mind. I'd learned long ago that time means something different in places like this. Patients wait. That's the rule. Eventually, I stood up and walked back to the counter. The receptionist barely glanced at me. I told her my name again. She asked me to sit down, said they were running a little behind. I nodded, returned to my seat, and continued waiting. I was used to being overlooked. Retirement has a way of shrinking you. You become the person who moves quietly, waits patiently, and doesn't ask for much. My daughter Lauren worked here, not at the front desk, of course. She was a doctor now, a general practitioner. She had her own office, her name on the website, even an article in the local newsletter about her commitment to community care. I had clipped it out and tucked it into a drawer at home. I didn't tell her. She rarely answered my calls anymore, and when she did, she sounded distracted, hurried, like she had somewhere more important to be. I suppose she usually did. I didn't expect special treatment. I wasn't here to be her mother today. I was just another patient. That's what I told myself over and over, like a chant. But I still found myself sitting up straighter when I heard her name being spoken down the hallway. I didn't turn to look. I didn't want to seem desperate. Eventually, a nurse emerged and called my name. She was young with a ponytail and tired eyes. She asked me to follow her down a hallway lined with exam rooms. I noticed the new flooring, dark vinyl, meant to look like wood. Everything in the clinic was designed to seem warm, but not too personal. Professional comfort. That was the style now. I sat on the paper-covered exam table while she took my vitals. She asked about my medications, my history, any new concerns. I answered everything honestly, but without detail. I didn't want to waste her time. When she was done, she said the doctor would be in shortly, and then I waited again. The walls were a pale green, the kind that hospitals favor, meant to be calming but cold in the wrong light. I looked at the medical posters, all too familiar from years of routine checkups. My hands rested in my lap, still as stone. I didn't know who would walk through the door. Part of me hoped it would be someone else. Part of me hoped it would be her. When the door finally opened, it was Lauren, my daughter. She wore her white coat like armor. Her expression was neutral, efficient. She glanced at the chart in her hand, barely registering me. There was a flicker of recognition, too quick to catch, but she didn't greet me. She simply walked to the counter, checked the screen, and muttered something under her breath. I waited. She asked a question about my symptoms without looking at me. I answered. Her tone was flat, clipped. She didn't ask how I'd been, didn't smile, didn't soften. She treated me like every other patient, and maybe that was what hurt the most. Not that she was rude or cold, but that she seemed to see right through me, like I was invisible. When I left the exam room, the receptionist's smile was still there, exactly the same. Nothing had changed, except now something had settled in me, a quiet, almost imperceptible shift. Not anger, not pain, just awareness. The kind that seeps into your bones and stays there. I stepped outside into the winter air and pulled the scarf tighter around my neck. The lavender scent rose again, faint and warm. I stood still for a moment, watching the snow begin to fall. Something had shifted. I didn't know what I would do with that knowledge. Not yet. But I knew this much. I hadn't come here just to be seen. I had come to remember who I was. I always believed in the power of paper. In my years working for the city, I learned that truth often lived between the margins of a printed page, buried in footnotes, buried in contracts, buried in the places no one bothered to look. That belief never left me, even in retirement. After years of balancing budgets and verifying line items, I couldn't help but keep my own little archive. Stacks of folders, meticulously labeled, filled the low bookshelf beneath the window in my spare bedroom. From the street, the room looked like any other, just another aging woman's house in a quiet Maine neighborhood. But that window held a history only I understood. That day, when I returned home after my appointment, I didn't take off my coat. I walked straight to the spare room, opened the curtains, and let the pale light settle over the beige manila folders. Dust floated in the beams, undisturbed, like memories waiting to be disturbed. I reached for a red folder near the end, one I had labeled 3 months earlier, Rosebridge Medical Holdings. It had started innocently. A call from an old colleague, David Geller, who had once worked in commercial property assessments and now dabbled in real estate transitions. He told me the building that housed Rosebridge Medical was likely changing hands. The owner, an older gentleman named Eugene Mercer, was looking to sell. No fuss, no bidding war, just a quiet transfer. David thought I might be interested, given my background in public budgeting and my knack for turning property into stable income. At the time, I hadn't thought of Lauren. I hadn't even realized that her clinic operated out of that specific building. To me, it was simply an opportunity. I had spent a lifetime watching money pass through hands that didn't know how to hold it. I knew the value of solid property. I also knew the worth of silence. I made the first inquiry through an attorney. I didn't want my name tied directly to the transaction. Not because I was hiding anything, but because anonymity gave me room to think. I had no intention of interfering in the clinic's business. I wasn't a competitor or a disruptor. I was simply investing. Weeks passed. Paperwork arrived. I read every page. I traced the ownership history back 22 years. I verified zoning ordinances and checked maintenance records. I made sure the heating system had passed its last inspection. My lawyer joked that I was more thorough than the city inspectors. I didn't correct him. When the time came to finalize the purchase, I set up a trust. Not under my name, not directly. I became the sole beneficiary, but the paperwork showed the name of a shell entity. Clean, simple, private. I didn't tell Lauren. After the closing, the first document I received was a summary of tenant leases. That was when her name hit me like a sharp wind. Dr. Lauren Blake, General Practitioner, Suite 201. My breath caught. I read it again, not because I hadn't believed it the first time, but because I needed to feel the weight of it. My daughter was renting space in a building I now owned. She didn't know. She didn't suspect. I sat down on the edge of the bed and placed the file on my lap. My fingers lingered on the corners, smoothing the paper as though it were a fragile relic. I didn't know what to make of the coincidence. Was it fate? Irony? Some strange circular justice? For weeks, I left the file on the windowsill. I didn't open it. I let it sit, like a guest I wasn't ready to confront. Every morning, when I opened the curtains, I would glance at the folder. I told myself I wasn't ready, but that wasn't the truth. The truth was simpler. I didn't know what I wanted from it. I didn't want revenge. That wasn't my nature. I wasn't bitter. I wasn't even angry. Not yet. What I felt was something else, a kind of quiet curiosity, a flicker of awareness that hadn't been lit in years. Something had shifted, and now I was circling the perimeter of that feeling, afraid to step into it fully. Eventually, I opened the folder again. I examined her lease. The terms were standard: monthly payments, maintenance responsibilities, renewal clauses. Nothing unusual. But I read every word because words mattered. They always had. There was a clause in the contract, tucked near the end, about conduct expectations within the premises, a vague paragraph about professional decorum, respectful interactions, and adherence to clinic-wide standards. The kind of language lawyers inserted to appease liability concerns, the kind of language most tenants overlooked. I didn't. I highlighted it with a yellow marker, not out of spite, out of instinct. The snow fell steadily outside, gathering along the edge of the window pane. I sat back, my hands resting on the arms of the chair, the folder open beside me like an old photo album. I wasn't sure what came next. I wasn't planning anything. I wasn't scheming. I was simply paying attention. Years ago, I taught Lauren how to read contracts. She had scoffed, bored, a teenager full of impatience. I made her sit at the kitchen table and underline every clause in her college housing agreement. She rolled her eyes, but she did it. She learned to be careful because I insisted on it. Now I was the one reading her lease, alone in a quiet room, with the past rustling through the blinds like wind. Something had begun. I couldn't name it yet, but I felt it settling around me like snow on a still day, soft, certain, and silent. I got my hair done on a Thursday morning. It wasn't something I usually bothered with. Most days, I kept it pulled back with a simple clip, practical and out of the way. But that day, I booked an appointment at a small salon near the river. The kind of place with tiny glasses of lemon water and the low hum of old jazz in the background. I sat under warm lights while a young woman named Kira washed and trimmed my hair. She was gentle, quiet, and careful. I asked her to cut it short, neater, cleaner, less like someone clinging to length out of habit. I asked for something that looked intentional. I didn't say why I was changing it. I didn't say whose eyes I was trying not to look into or what it meant to feel like a stranger in a familiar face. I just sat still and watched the pieces of gray and white fall into my lap like little discarded questions. After the haircut, I walked through the town center with my coat open, scarf tucked in, and a slight breeze cooling the back of my neck. I passed by shops and cafes, catching my reflection in windows. I looked like someone I didn't fully recognize, but not in a bad way. It was like meeting a version of myself who had been waiting her turn. That afternoon, I went back to the clinic. I didn't have an appointment. I didn't need one. I told the receptionist I was dropping off some updated insurance paperwork, which was only partially true. I had brought an envelope with a copy of my supplemental policy just in case she asked to see it. She didn't. I sat in the waiting room for 20 minutes, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I watched the staff come and go. Nurses with clipboards, assistants with tablets, patients with quiet eyes and worn shoes. I sat near the window this time, where the late sun poured in and made the linoleum floors shimmer like glass. Then I saw her, my daughter. She walked down the hallway speaking with a colleague, flipping through a file. Her white coat was freshly pressed, her shoes polished, her makeup understated and perfect. Her hair was tied back, smooth and professional, not a strand out of place. She looked powerful, respected. She looked like she belonged. She didn't see me. She walked right past the waiting area, not glancing toward the chairs. I noticed something in her gait, brisk, slightly mechanical, the walk of someone who had trained herself not to pause. She kept her voice low, efficient, authoritative. I leaned back and exhaled slowly. The nurse at the counter called a new name, and the waiting room shifted. People stood, people sat. The rhythm continued. I stayed a little longer, then quietly stood and walked out. The envelope was still in my bag. I hadn't left it. That night, I sat by the kitchen table with a mirror propped against the fruit bowl. I studied the angles of my new haircut. It framed my face differently. My cheekbones looked sharper, my eyes more alert. I thought about how much time we spend grooming ourselves for the approval of others, often without realizing it. I wondered how many years I had worn my hair the same way, just because someone once said it suited me. When I closed the mirror, I thought of Lauren's face, her cheekbones, her posture, her calm, distant voice. I wondered who she was performing for, who had shaped the way she carried herself. I wondered if she ever looked in the mirror and saw someone unfamiliar. The next day, I returned again. This time, I sat on the far side of the waiting room, beneath a framed print of a mountain range in soft blues. A peaceful picture. I liked the way it made the wall feel open, as if something larger was waiting beyond the paint and plaster. I wore a blazer I hadn't touched in years. Navy wool with thin lapels, one button missing inside the cuff. I paired it with a silk blouse and black slacks. Conservative, formal, neutral. Nothing flashy, but nothing easily dismissed either. I wanted to see how long it would take for her to notice. An elderly man in a plaid jacket coughed beside me, and I handed him a tissue from my bag. He nodded in thanks, eyes watery. We didn't speak. Time passed. Lauren walked by again, holding a tablet, eyes scanning the screen. She didn't look up. She turned the corner and disappeared. I sat still. No part of me wanted to chase her down, to tap her shoulder, to force a moment. It wasn't about confrontation. It was about witnessing. There was something haunting about watching your own child from a distance. Not the distance of geography, but the deeper kind. The kind that grows from silence, from years of postponed calls and filtered words, from needing to believe everything is fine when it isn't. I returned home just after 4. The light outside was already beginning to fade. I poured a cup of tea, sat by the window, and opened one of the folders on the sill. The one marked Tenant Communications. Inside were emails, memos, Routine correspondence. A note from Lauren's assistant requesting an updated cleaning schedule. A reminder about hallway renovations. A small stack of paper carrying the weight of 1,000 little systems that kept the building alive. I set the folder aside and opened another one. This one thinner, marked only with her name. It contained her lease agreement, signed and initialed. I traced her signature with my finger, not reading, just feeling. Her handwriting had changed. More upright now, more compressed, less flourished, less open. I closed the folder and leaned back. There is a particular kind of ache in being unrecognized, not by strangers, but by someone whose face you once kissed before sleep, whose bruises you once bandaged, whose future you once carried inside your own body. It was strange to think that I had seen her more clearly in those silent passings than in any recent conversation. Strange to feel both invisible and omnipresent at the same time. I pressed my hand to my chest. My heart beat steadily. I was still here, and she didn't even know I had changed my hair. I chose the same seat every time I went. The third one from the corner, against the wall, beneath the humming vent that never stopped rattling. It was the least desirable spot in the waiting room, too cold in winter, too warm in summer, but it gave me the clearest view of the hallway. From there, I could watch the staff come and go, see who lingered by the front desk, who smiled, who didn't. It wasn't about spying, it was about seeing. There's a difference. The chair was stiff and narrow, with cracked vinyl that tugged at my coat when I leaned back. It creaked when I crossed my legs, and the armrests had faint smudges where countless hands had rested before mine. It wasn't comfortable, but it was reliable. No one ever sat next to me. That mattered. People avoided the corners, the edges, the older woman who didn't speak much. That gave me space. I kept a notepad in my bag. Nothing dramatic, just observations, times, names, small moments that most people would never think to remember. A nurse who rolled her eyes when an elderly patient asked the same question twice. A receptionist who answered the phone with a different tone, depending on the last name on the caller ID. A doctor who walked too quickly, even when there was no reason to rush. I wasn't judging, I was cataloging. One afternoon, as I sat in my usual seat, I noticed the artificial plant in the corner had been turned. The side that faced me now was sun-faded, the plastic leaves brittle. I wondered who had decided to rotate it and why. I noticed small things like that, details that didn't matter until they did. Lauren passed by the hallway twice that day. The first time, she was carrying a tray of sample medications and speaking to a pharmaceutical rep. Her smile was sharp and bright, but it didn't reach her eyes. The second time, she walked alone, typing on her phone, unaware of her surroundings. She didn't see me either time. I had stopped expecting her to. Instead, I paid attention to everything else, the way the receptionist greeted older patients with a half smile, then checked their insurance status before offering a real one, the way the nurse avoided eye contact with nervous parents, the way no one ever adjusted the thermostat, even when the room filled with coughs and shivers. One day, a woman about my age sat down beside me. She wore a floral blouse and carried a purse that jingled when she moved. She offered a polite smile. I returned it. For 15 minutes, we sat without speaking. When the nurse finally called her name, she gripped my arm briefly before standing. Just a squeeze. I nodded. She walked away. After she left, I opened my notebook and wrote one line. She didn't want to be alone. Neither did I, really. But my presence had become part of the scenery, unnoticed, unremarkable. I wasn't invisible in the way some people think, like a ghost or a forgotten coat. I was more like wallpaper, always there, part of the room, never questioned. Sometimes I brought a book and held it open without reading. It was easier than pretending to be on a phone I didn't care to use. The others around me were always scrolling, always connected to something else. I stayed where I was. I watched the cleaning crew come in every evening. The same man mopped the hallway, always starting at the far end and working his way toward the front. He never changed his pattern. I respected that. Patterns made people predictable. Predictability made things easier to track. From my seat by the wall, I began to see the cracks. Not in the walls themselves, but in the way the clinic operated. Subtle things, delays in charting, discrepancies in patient flow. I didn't need a title to know when something was misaligned. My whole career had been built on finding gaps that others missed. So I watched, I listened, I recorded, quietly, patiently. I never brought attention to myself. I never asked questions. I simply returned again and again, always choosing the same chair. Eventually, the staff stopped glancing at me altogether. I became part of the furniture, and that was exactly what I wanted. The receptionist never remembered my name. Each visit, she asked me to spell it. I always did, calmly, clearly, as if it didn't sting. There's a kind of discipline in waiting, in holding your place without flinching. People think silence is surrender, but I've learned that silence is often strategy. The quieter you become, the more they forget to guard their words. One day, as I was leaving, I overheard two nurses talking near the supply closet. They didn't lower their voices. They never even noticed me. One of them said Lauren had gotten into it with another doctor, something about treatment plans and liability. The other laughed and said, "She thinks she owns the place." They both laughed. I didn't. I walked past them, out the sliding glass doors, into the wind. I didn't write that exchange in my notebook. I didn't need to. Some truths don't require ink. They settle deeper in a place no paper can hold. The first time I held the lease agreement, I treated it like something sacred, not because of what it said, but because of what it represented. It was a contract, yes, but also a kind of confession. People forget that leases, like all agreements, reveal more than they intend. The language of legality has its own rhythm. If you read it slowly enough, you can hear what's unsaid. I sat at my dining room table with the papers spread out before me, a cup of lukewarm tea forgotten at my elbow. The lease was 12 pages long, standard length, formatted with care, filled with predictable clauses about maintenance, insurance, and rent increases. Nothing unusual at first glance, but I never read for what was obvious. I read for what had been assumed. The signature was there on the last page, Lauren's signature, her initials on every clause. Her handwriting had become smaller, tighter over the years. I remembered when she used to loop her L like a little ribbon when she was in high school. Now it was all business, sharp, no frills strokes. The way professionals sign documents when they're too busy to notice the weight of what they're agreeing to. Her signature sat opposite the line that read, "Landlord's representative." That signature was mine. Not in name, of course. The trust had a designated signatory, my lawyer, acting on behalf of the shell company that legally owned the building. But every decision, every clause, every approval had gone through me. I was the architect of the words she never questioned. I had read every paragraph 3 times before it ever reached her desk. I had included the standard conduct clause, tucked into Section 7, Paragraph 4. All tenants and employees shall maintain professional behavior and ethical standards within the premises and engage with patients, staff, and visitors in a respectful and non-discriminatory manner. It was the kind of line no one flagged. Too vague to argue, too common to resist. But I had marked it in red ink in my private copy. It was my fulcrum. I didn't expect her to violate it, but I needed it there, like a door left slightly ajar, just in case. Over the next few weeks, I watched her more carefully. I took note of how she interacted with the staff, how she answered patients, how she dismissed concerns that she found beneath her. I saw her brush past older patients without a second glance. I noticed when she interrupted nurses in the hallway, issuing instructions without waiting for a response. I began to see patterns in her behavior, subtle habits of detachment and dismissal that others seemed to accept without question. I did not. One morning, I called the management office posing as a prospective tenant. I asked routine questions about space availability and terms. Then, casually, I asked how disputes or complaints were typically handled. The manager explained the internal review process and how leases included provisions for behavioral evaluations, though they were rarely enforced. That was all I needed to hear. Enforcement was optional, but possible. That night, I drafted a memo, not a threat, not even a warning. Just a formal notification that a review of professional conduct across all units would be taking place in accordance with the terms of the lease. It would be framed as routine, a gentle sweep, nothing punitive. I signed it using the name of the property manager assigned to our trust, a name no one would recognize, but the memo bore the full weight of ownership. I didn't send it immediately. Instead, I let it sit on my desk for 3 days. I read it each morning with fresh eyes. I asked myself why I was doing it. Was it to punish her? To make her feel small? The answer was no. It wasn't revenge I wanted. It was accountability, not just for me, but for the people she moved past every day without seeing. When I finally sent the memo, I did so with the steadiness of someone who had lived long enough to understand restraint. I didn't follow up. I didn't wait for a reply. I let the silence do the work. A week passed, then 2. I returned to the clinic as usual, taking my seat by the wall, my coat folded neatly in my lap. I saw her walk by once. Her shoulders were tighter than before. She moved faster, but with less control. There was a nervousness in her step I hadn't seen before. She didn't smile at the receptionist. She didn't speak to anyone unless she had to. She carried a clipboard with both hands, clutched tightly like a shield. The following day, I received a copy of the clinic's internal newsletter in the mail. It was addressed to building tenants and stakeholders. Inside, a small paragraph mentioned the new performance and conduct evaluations being implemented as part of a quarterly review. Standard procedure, it said. No cause for concern. I smiled when I read that. Nothing about what I was doing was cruel. It was precise. It was deliberate. It was what I had always done. Expose the fault lines beneath the surface, the cracks everyone else had learned to ignore. This time, the blueprint was human, and the signature that had opened the door to it all was hers. I placed the newsletter in a folder marked Compliance, slid it into the filing cabinet beneath the window, and closed the drawer. She had signed her name, and now the ink had meaning. There was a corridor on the second floor of the building that connected the west and east wings of the clinic. It was narrow, long, and lined with tall glass panels that let in a bright, cold light during the morning hours. It had always struck me as oddly exposed, too open, too revealing, like a tunnel designed not just for passage, but for observation. I found myself drawn to it more and more as the weeks went on. I began to walk it slowly, not out of necessity, but as a ritual. It became part of my quiet rotation. First, the reception area, then the second-floor stairwell, and finally the glass corridor. I never lingered long enough to draw attention. I carried a manila folder under my arm, the way staff might carry patient files or building notices, so that I looked like I belonged. That hallway had a peculiar quality. It amplified footsteps. Mine echoed in soft double time as I passed through it, the soles of my shoes clicking faintly on the tiles. I could see my reflection in the glass. Older, yes, but upright, composed. I began to study that reflection the way one studies a stranger, curious but detached. My hair still neat from the last trim. My coat buttoned all the way up. My shoulders not hunched. On one particular morning, Frost edged the bottom corners of the glass, curling like lace around the frames. I had arrived earlier than usual. I wanted to observe the staff as they began their day. I stood at the far end of the corridor, just beyond the turn, and waited. Lauren appeared at exactly 8:06. She came from the west wing, where the break room and lockers were located. She wore the same white coat, the same black flats, the same neutral expression, but something in her eyes had shifted. They darted more quickly now, scanning the hallway, as if trying to anticipate what might be waiting ahead. Her movements were sharper, clipped. She didn't see me. I was behind the turn, still in shadow. I watched her walk the corridor, watched her reflection keep pace with her in the glass. There was something dissonant about it. The real Lauren and her mirrored self didn't quite move in unison. The illusion of symmetry was broken by the weight in her shoulders, the stiffness in her posture. It was the body language of someone carrying something unspoken. I stepped back and let her pass. After she disappeared around the corner, I continued my slow walk. This time, I noticed a few fingerprints on the glass, smudges near the middle panels, as though someone had leaned against them absent-mindedly. Imperfections in a space designed to look pristine. I ran my sleeve across one of the marks, then paused. I thought about clarity, how people chase it, how they believe it comes from things like windows and titles and uniforms. But real clarity doesn't come from what you see. It comes from knowing what you're looking for. The rest of the building was unusually quiet that day. The usual shuffle of nurses and the low murmur of waiting room conversations were subdued, almost cautious. Word had likely begun to circulate. Not about me, my role remained invisible, but about the reviews, the evaluations, the silent presence of something unspoken moving through the walls. I visited the janitorial office after lunch, a small corner room near the loading dock, mostly forgotten unless there was a spill or a plumbing issue. I didn't go in. I stood at the door, reading the posted work schedule. I recognized the name of the cleaner assigned to the corridor, Luis. He had worked in the building for almost 10 years, quiet and consistent. Later that week, I left an envelope at the office addressed to him. Inside, a thank you card and a prepaid grocery card. No note, just gratitude. The kind that doesn't need explanation. Because I had seen how he paused in the glass corridor each day, checking the windows for fingerprints, adjusting the blinds ever so slightly to let the morning light filter evenly through. Small acts of stewardship. Small acts of respect. On Friday, I returned again. The glass corridor was empty, clean, sunlit. My reflection looked back at me without judgment. I walked to the center and stopped. For a moment, I imagined Lauren standing where I was now. I tried to picture what she saw each day, what she noticed, what she ignored. I wondered if she ever looked at her own reflection and thought of me. The tiles were cool under my feet. I looked down and counted the spaces between them. I did the math in my head, calculating how many steps it took to cross the corridor, how many seconds from end to end. It was the kind of mental exercise I had done for years in government buildings, waiting in lobbies and elevators. It helped me stay grounded. Then I looked out the glass, past the parking lot, past the leafless trees and the sloping lawn. I saw the edge of the town beyond it, grocery stores, gas stations, small homes with porches and wind chimes. All of it felt distant, as though it belonged to someone else. I placed my palm gently against the glass. The cold surprised me. I kept it there for a few seconds, long enough to leave a mark. And then I turned and walked away, my reflection sliding beside me until I reached the end and turned the corner, out of sight. The corridor remained behind me, glowing, untouched. But the fingerprint stayed. It started with a service report, a routine maintenance update that arrived in a thin envelope with the rest of the building correspondence. I opened it late in the evening, after dinner, with the television humming quietly in the background. I was only half paying attention, expecting nothing more than water usage statistics or an invoice for snow removal. But then I read the words boiler system at end of life status, and everything slowed. The report detailed the status of the building's central heating system. 2 units had been in use since the structure was built, both now well past their recommended lifespan. One had shown signs of pressure instability. The recommendation was clear: replacement within 90 days or risk total failure. I sat with the paper in my lap for a long time. I didn't feel surprised. Nothing in buildings ever really worked the way people thought it did. Everyone assumed stability until it failed. That was true of walls, wiring, foundations, and people. I retrieved the building's maintenance log from my filing cabinet. Over the years, I had grown familiar with the rhythm of repairs: small leaks, annual inspections, HVAC tune-ups. But this was the first major issue to surface since I had taken ownership. The boiler, the source of heat, the unseen machine responsible for the quiet comfort that everyone took for granted. I reviewed the installation dates, noted the original contractor, and flagged the most recent service entries. Everything pointed to one truth: the building would need to shut down temporarily if the unit was replaced. It wasn't an emergency yet, but it would become one. I had a decision to make. I called the contractor listed in the file the following morning. We scheduled an inspection for later that week. The man who arrived was in his 60s, with hands like worn tools and a calm voice. He confirmed the report. The system was functioning, but barely. A cold snap, a blockage, or a pressure surge could disable it within days. He suggested I act soon. I didn't ask for a second opinion. Instead, I went back into the clinic the next day and sat in the waiting room like I always did. I watched the patients shuffle in, shrugging off coats, rubbing their hands together. I watched the staff move in practiced patterns, oblivious to the warmth around them. They didn't know how fragile that comfort was. Lauren passed by twice. She looked more tired than usual, her face pale under the overhead lighting. I could tell she hadn't been sleeping. I wondered if she had begun to feel the shift in the air. Not just the physical temperature, but the quiet tension pressing in from the walls. She didn't look at me. I had stopped expecting her to. But I saw her glance toward the vents near the ceiling once, as if something in the air had changed. Later that day, I approved the order for the new boiler. I scheduled the shutdown for a Friday afternoon, ensuring minimal patient disruption. Notices were sent through official channels. Facility maintenance requiring temporary closure. No further explanation was necessary. On the day of the shutdown, I arrived early. The air in the clinic had a different weight to it. The reception area was quieter, the usual hum of machinery replaced by an odd stillness. Staff moved with slight confusion, unsure whether to treat the situation as routine or alarming. I watched as Lauren stood by the front desk, flipping through a clipboard, her brow furrowed. She spoke briefly to the receptionist, who shrugged and gestured toward the back offices. No one seemed to know who had authorized the work. No one thought to ask me. By midday, the heating was off completely. The air turned crisp, then cool. Some patients rescheduled, others left in coats still buttoned. Staff huddled near vents, unsure whether to stay or go. Maintenance workers in thick jackets hauled tools and piping down the hall. The boiler room door stayed propped open, releasing a faint metallic scent into the corridor. I stayed longer than usual. I didn't need to, but I wanted to. I watched the building slow down, grow quieter, more fragile. The heat had always been invisible, taken for granted, like all the things we never thank until they vanish. That evening, I walked through the second floor alone. The hallways echoed under my steps. Rooms sat empty. Charts hung untouched on walls. Somewhere downstairs, a pipe groaned. I paused outside Lauren's office. The door was ajar. I didn't go in. I stood there, listening to the silence. There was no movement, no voices, just the soft creak of a building holding its breath. That night, I boiled water on my own stove and sat in the kitchen wrapped in a sweater. I thought about how heat reveals itself only when it's missing, about how much we assume is permanent until the absence reminds us otherwise. I looked down at the service report still sitting on my table, folded neatly beside my notebook. A small corner of the page had curled in the warmth of the lamp, and the building had begun to cool. The cafe where we met was quiet, tucked into the back corner of a brick-lined plaza, far enough from the main road to stay unnoticed by the casual passerby. It was the kind of place where the coffee came in thick white mugs, the sugar was in ceramic bowls, and the music was soft enough to disappear beneath the scrape of a chair or the clink of a spoon. I had chosen it deliberately, neutral ground, quiet, civilized. I sat at the table facing the window, my coat draped over the back of the chair, the file folder resting neatly beside my cup. The folder wasn't thick, but it didn't need to be. A few printed memos, a lease agreement, an excerpt from the conduct clause, all printed on clean paper, clipped precisely, no annotations. The documents had their own weight. They didn't need underlining. I watched the door without looking like I was watching. The cold outside had left condensation on the glass, tiny beads clinging to the frame like breath held too long. I took a sip of coffee and waited. She arrived 6 minutes late. Lauren walked in with her coat still on, her posture tight, her expression carefully arranged. She scanned the room quickly, saw me, and hesitated just for a second before making her way to the table. She didn't say anything as she sat. She didn't ask why we were meeting. She didn't have to. Her silence was heavy, calculated. I slid the folder across the table, not with drama, not with warning. Just a steady motion, as if passing a menu. She looked down at it, but didn't open it right away. Instead, she stared at the top page, the one with her signature. Her eyes didn't move, not at first. Then slowly, she opened the cover and flipped through the contents. One page, then another, then another. Her face didn't change. Years of medical training had taught her how to keep still under pressure. But I had changed her diapers. I had watched her fall asleep with a fever. I had walked her through multiplication tables and adolescent heartbreak. There were lines in her face I could read like a map. I saw the shift in her jaw, the tightening in her throat, the flicker behind her eyes when the meaning of each document began to settle in. Still, she said nothing. I didn't speak either. Words, at that moment, would have been too soft or too sharp. There was nothing to defend, nothing to accuse. Everything was already there in print, signed, sealed, dated. She closed the folder and pushed it back across the table without touching her coffee. Her hands remained in her lap. She looked at me, not with anger, not even with disappointment, just the hollow weight of disbelief. I met her eyes, and we stayed there in silence. She had always believed herself sharper, smarter, more calculated, and perhaps she was. But she had also underestimated me in a way only children can underestimate their parents, believing that growing up means leaving behind, believing that the past becomes irrelevant once it's out of view. She hadn't realized that quiet doesn't mean blind, that silence doesn't mean absence, that time doesn't erase instinct. And perhaps most importantly, she hadn't realized what it meant to sign your name on something without reading it fully. I saw her open her mouth slightly, as if about to ask a question, then close it again. There was nothing left to ask. She rose from the table without another word, picked up her bag, and walked out of the cafe. I didn't turn to watch her go. I didn't need to. The air around me shifted as she passed, and I felt the door close behind her like a seal, not of finality, just of acknowledgement. I stayed a few more minutes, finishing my coffee, folding the folder back into my satchel. The waitress passed by and asked if I wanted anything else. I shook my head. She smiled politely, unaware of the quiet gravity that had just taken place over that worn wooden table. Outside, the sky had turned the color of old tin. Clouds stretched low, heavy with snow that hadn't yet begun to fall. I pulled on my coat and stepped out into the cold. The air tasted sharp, metallic. On the way home, I drove the long route, past the edges of the town where the trees were taller and the roads less traveled. I let the heater hum low, just enough to keep the windshield clear. I passed the elementary school where Lauren had once played, the park where she learned to ride a bike, the old community library where she first learned to read, places that no longer mattered to her, places that still held echoes of her voice. When I arrived home, I placed the folder back in the cabinet, not as a weapon, not as a trophy, just as a record, a moment preserved. That night, I stood in front of the mirror before bed. I looked at my own reflection the way I had once looked at hers, not with judgment, not with pride, just with recognition, a kind of still, tired truth. You can't out-argue a mother, not because she's always right, but because she never forgets. The clinic felt different after the heating shut down. Quieter somehow, not in sound, but in spirit. The rhythm I had grown used to, the shuffle of patients, the echo of footsteps in the hallway, the distant ring of the front desk phone, had dulled. It wasn't silence exactly. It was absence, and it settled into the building like dust on a forgotten shelf. I hadn't seen Lauren in over a week. I returned to the waiting room each day, sitting in my usual chair, nodding politely at the receptionist, who still didn't remember my name. The nurses moved more cautiously now, their voices lowered, their steps a little less hurried. Even the patients seemed more subdued, like they sensed something was brewing just beneath the surface, though no one dared ask what. On a Thursday morning, I climbed the stairs to the second floor earlier than usual. I didn't have an appointment. I carried a folder under my arm and a black leather notebook in my coat pocket. The folder was empty. The notebook was not. The hallway was nearly empty. A janitor wheeled a cart past me, nodding without a word. I walked slowly, tracing the familiar path along the corridor with the tall windows, then turned right at the end, past the staff lounge and toward the row of private offices. Hers was the second-to-last door on the left. It was unlocked. I paused for a moment before pushing it open. There was no nameplate, no indicator of who belonged inside. Just a dark wooden door and a brushed silver handle, slightly warm to the touch. I opened it. The room was still. The blinds were halfway closed, filtering the daylight into thin stripes that stretched across the floor and over the desk. The air was still warm, faintly scented with something sterile and floral. There were no papers on the surface of the desk, no notes, no patient files, just a monitor powered down, a keyboard pushed slightly to the side, and a chair tucked neatly under the desk like it hadn't been used in days. A mug sat on the windowsill. It was navy blue, chipped near the lip. I recognized it. I had bought a pair just like it at a church fair in 2002, back when Lauren was still in school. She used to drink cocoa from one during exam week. I hadn't seen it in years. Beside the mug was a small frame, silver, simple, modern. Inside was a photo of a child, a boy, maybe 8 or 9, freckled, smiling, his eyes crinkled at the corners the way Lauren's had when she was younger. I had seen him only a handful of times, always through the filter of short holiday visits and carefully orchestrated family photos. But I knew that smile. I had once carried its earliest version in my arms. I didn't touch the frame. I didn't sit in the chair. I walked to the bookshelf against the far wall and studied the titles, medical journals, reference books, a few worn paperbacks tucked into the corners, A single orchid sat in a ceramic pot on the top shelf. Its petals were just beginning to wilt. There was something intimate about the room in its emptiness, not neglected, not abandoned, just paused, like a breath held too long. I felt the weight of that pause settle in my chest. I stepped back toward the door, then turned around once more. The desk's bottom drawer was slightly ajar. I hesitated, then reached down and pulled it open. Inside was a stack of blank intake forms, a stapler, 2 pens, and a folded piece of paper. It was a page torn from a legal pad. On it, a short list, just a few names, checkboxes beside each, and some quick notes, follow-up calls, lab results. One name was circled, mine. There was no note attached, no instruction, just the circle drawn lightly in blue ink, as if she hadn't meant to press down hard. I stared at it for a moment, then folded the paper again and placed it back exactly as I had found it. The hallway was even quieter when I stepped out. I walked past the other offices, each door closed, each silence deeper than the last. The building seemed to breathe more slowly now. I took the stairs instead of the elevator. Each step creaked softly, the way old steps do when they remember too much. At the bottom, I paused in the lobby. A new patient was speaking to the receptionist, holding out an insurance card with both hands. The receptionist smiled automatically, nodded, and tapped at the keyboard. I stood to the side, unnoticed, invisible by design. Before I left, I glanced back one more time. Not to see Lauren, not to confirm anything, just to remember the feeling of that room, the light across the desk, the forgotten mug, the photo by the window. There was nothing remarkable in the details, but something had changed. Not in the room, in me. I didn't need confrontation. I didn't need apology. What I had seen was enough. Sometimes an empty room says more than any argument ever could, and that day I heard every word of it. The snow had started to melt by the time I stopped going to the clinic every morning. The sidewalks were still edged with gray slush, but the air had changed. It carried the faint smell of thawing earth and wet pavement, and with it came a soft release, the loosening of something that had been wound too tightly for too long. I found myself waking without urgency, no longer measuring the day by clinic hours or hallway footsteps. I still owned the building. The paperwork sat in a locked drawer in my study, alongside copies of the trust agreement, the signed lease, the maintenance invoices, and the stack of quarterly reports I had annotated in red ink for my own satisfaction. But I no longer opened those drawers often, not because they ceased to matter, but because I no longer needed them to tell me who I was. I walked the neighborhood more now. I noticed things I hadn't seen in years. A new bench near the bus stop, a tree that had lost half its branches in the storm, a child's mitten, forgotten and soaked through, clinging to a fence post like a tiny flag of surrender. These small changes felt like signals, proof that life shifted without permission and that ownership meant little in the face of time. One afternoon, I returned to the building. I hadn't planned to. I had simply been walking past, and something in the stillness of the facade drew me in. The lobby was quiet as usual. The receptionist had changed. A younger woman now, with soft eyes and a voice that carried the hint of nervous optimism. She looked up when I entered, nodded politely, then turned back to her screen. I stood near the window and watched for a while. The patients came and went, some with walkers, some with toddlers, some with eyes that refused to meet anyone else's. The rhythm had returned to the clinic, not the same as before. Quieter, more careful, like a song slowed down just enough for the listener to hear the lyrics. I didn't go upstairs. I didn't need to. The hallway where I once sat had a new chair near the corner. The plant had been replaced. The vents had been cleaned. Someone had added a small shelf with a stack of health pamphlets arranged by color. All changes made by people who didn't know me, yet touched things I had once watched with such intent. That, too, felt like a kind of closure. Later that week, I received a package in the mail. No return address. Inside was a book of essays on ethical medicine, dog-eared, lightly annotated, with a note tucked between the pages. It wasn't signed, but the handwriting was hers. I didn't cry when I read it. I didn't feel vindicated or moved to respond. I simply placed the book on my bedside table beside the photo of her at age 7, missing both front teeth, holding a stethoscope made from yarn and a plastic spoon. Ownership had once meant control. It had meant leverage, oversight, the final say. But that definition had eroded slowly, quietly, until it was replaced by something harder to define, something quieter, more enduring. I had come to understand that real ownership wasn't about decisions or signatures. It was about responsibility, about care, and most of all, about knowing when to hold on and when to let go. That winter, I cleaned out the cabinet in my home office. I shredded the older copies, stored the essentials, labeled the boxes in a careful, steady hand. I left the drawer half full, not empty, but not crammed with the weight of needing to prove anything. In the evenings, I began to bake again. Small things, muffins, scones, cornbread, recipes I hadn't touched in decades. I left some on my neighbors' porches with notes written in pencil. Warm while fresh. I didn't sign them. I didn't wait for thanks. I spent time with people who didn't ask about my daughter. They didn't know the details, and I didn't offer them. I simply listened, offered tea, and spoke when I had something worth saying. The quiet between us was easy. On Sundays, I lit a candle in the kitchen before dusk, not for anyone in particular, not for remembrance or prayer, just to remind myself that stillness didn't mean emptiness, that I had made it through something, and I was still here. Lauren never said thank you, but she didn't have to, not anymore. There are certain acknowledgments that don't live in words, and I had already received mine, in the softened edge of her voice, in the unopened email she hadn't deleted, in the way she circled my name on a paper and didn't throw it away. I still passed the building from time to time. Sometimes I stopped. Most times I didn't. I liked knowing it was there, operating quietly, no longer needing me in the same way. I had built something solid, not perfect, not permanent, but solid. I had owned a building, but more than that, I had owned my silence, and that was enough.